Why did a will spark more outrage than a double murder? Why was the most troubled child rewarded with the largest share of a $200 million fortune? And what happens when the person accused of killing his parents is also the primary heir to everything they left behind? After the deaths of Rob Reiner and his wife, what should have been a moment of closure instead ignited a firestorm. The public didn't just mourn the loss of a legendary filmmaker, they turned their attention to something far more disturbing: his final will. According to documents that later surfaced, the majority of Reiner's vast estate was left to Nick Reiner, the son long known for addiction, instability, and repeated personal collapse. As outrage spread, an even darker question emerged. Nick was soon arrested and charged with the murder of his own parents. And suddenly, a chilling legal paradox stood at the center of the story. Could someone accused of such a crime still inherit the fortune of the very people he was accused of killing? Does the law automatically block him, or is there a loophole few people truly understand? What followed was not just a criminal investigation, but a brutal family war. Siblings turned into legal opponents. A leaked will raised suspicions about timing and intent. And buried beneath the money was something far more powerful: control over one of Hollywood's most valuable creative legacies. This is not just a story about death or inheritance. It's a story about love taken too far, protection that may have crossed into favoritism, and a family torn apart by fear, money, and unanswered questions. And as the legal battle unfolds, one question refuses to go away. Was this tragedy inevitable, or was it written into the will long before anyone saw it coming? On the 14th of December 2025, the quiet stability surrounding the Reiner family collapsed in an instant. Inside their Brentwood mansion in Los Angeles, Rob Reiner and his wife were found dead. What initially appeared to be an unthinkable tragedy quickly turned into a criminal investigation that stunned the public. Within hours, police arrested their son, Nick Reiner. He was formally charged with first-degree murder, accused of directly causing the deaths of both of his parents. The shock was immediate, but it was only the beginning. As news of the arrest spread, another question surfaced almost instantly, one that went beyond grief or criminal guilt. If Nick Reiner stood accused of killing his own parents, what would happen to the massive fortune they left behind? Would the law automatically block him from inheriting, or could the legal system treat the crime and the estate as two separate matters? Rob Reiner had 4 legal children: Nick, Romy, Jake, and Tracy, his adopted daughter from his first marriage. Under normal circumstances, the division of an estate that large would already be complex. But when the primary suspect in a double homicide is also one of the heirs, the situation becomes legally and morally explosive. This was no longer just a criminal case. It was the beginning of a high-stakes inheritance battle, one where the outcome would depend not only on guilt or innocence, but on how the law interprets intent, responsibility, and timing. And as the public soon learned, the answers were far from simple. At first glance, the law seems clear. California has a legal safeguard known as the Slayer Statute, a rule designed to prevent killers from profiting from their crimes. In simple terms, anyone who intentionally and criminally kills another person is treated, under the law, as if they died before their victim. That means they lose all rights to inherit, no matter what the will says. Estate and inheritance attorneys quickly pointed out that if Nick Reiner were convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder, the statute would apply automatically. His name would be legally erased from the line of inheritance, and his share of the estate would be redistributed among the remaining heirs. But the situation was not that simple. Legal experts emphasized that the Slayer Statute hinges on one critical element: intent. The killing must be proven intentional, and that single word opened the door to a legal gray zone that immediately unsettled public opinion. Under California law, a criminal conviction is not always required for the statute to apply. A civil court can also invoke it if there is sufficient evidence, more likely than not, that the accused intentionally caused the deaths. However, if intent cannot be legally established, the statute may not apply at all. This is where Nick's defense strategy becomes crucial. If he were found not guilty by reason of insanity, the legal system could determine that he lacked the mental capacity to form criminal intent. And without intent, the very law designed to block inheritance could fail to do so. Even more unsettling is the fact that a will is not the only legal structure governing an estate of this size. Much of Hollywood's wealth is often placed into family trusts, entities that operate under their own rules. A trust may include clauses that freeze distributions during criminal proceedings or grant trustees the power to delay payments indefinitely. But not all trusts are written the same way, so the question becomes unavoidable. If Nick is not legally deemed to have acted with intent, and if the trust does not explicitly block him, could he still inherit everything despite standing accused of killing his parents? For many watching this case unfold, the law no longer feels like a shield. It feels like a maze. As the legal debate intensified, a new revelation shifted the entire conversation. A document believed to be Rob Reiner's final will began circulating online, reportedly drafted around 2 years before his death. What stunned the public was not only who received the largest share, but what that share actually contained. According to the leaked document, Nick Reiner was allocated approximately 70% of his father's estimated $200 million estate, roughly $140 million in value. But this inheritance was not limited to cash or liquid assets. It included full control over some of the most lucrative and culturally significant film properties in modern Hollywood history. Among the assets listed were Rob Reiner's ownership interests and long-term royalty rights connected to films such as When Harry Met Sally, The Princess Bride, and A Few Good Men. These titles are not merely classics. They are evergreen properties. Industry analysts estimate that combined annual royalties from licensing, streaming, international distribution, and television syndication tied to these films alone can reach several $million per year, depending on market cycles. In addition, the will reportedly granted Nick control over royalty participation connected to Seinfeld, the television juggernaut produced through Castle Rock Entertainment. Even decades after its original run, Seinfeld continues to generate enormous revenue through streaming and syndication deals, with long-term valuations reaching into the hundreds of millions of dollars. While Nick would not own the entire franchise, inheriting a meaningful share of back-end participation represents a powerful and ongoing income stream. Beyond intellectual property, the will also designated Nick as the sole heir to the family's Brentwood mansion, a New England-style estate valued conservatively between $10 and $13 million, with some real estate analysts suggesting figures even higher depending on market conditions. This was not just a house, it was the physical heart of the Reiner family legacy. And tragically, the site where the deaths later occurred. The sheer scale of what Nick stood to inherit raised immediate questions. But even more unsettling was the timing of the will itself. 2 years earlier, Nick was widely believed to be at the lowest point of his life. His struggles with addiction had intensified. His professional prospects were uncertain. At times, he relied almost entirely on his parents for stability. Friends of the family later suggested that Rob and Michelle feared Nick might completely unravel without decisive intervention. Viewed through that lens, the will takes on a different meaning. Was this a strategic estate plan or an emergency act of protection driven by fear? Sources close to the family have suggested that the parents were not fully aligned. Rob, known for his deep emotional attachment to Nick, reportedly believed that granting responsibility and long-term assets could give his son a final chance at independence. Michelle, by contrast, was said to favor stricter boundaries, including mandatory rehabilitation and limits on financial access. If those internal tensions were real, then the will was more than a legal document. It was a snapshot of a family in crisis, one frozen in time just years before everything collapsed. And that leaves a haunting question. When a will is written at the peak of fear, does it reflect wisdom or desperation? As details of the leaked will continue to circulate, public outrage intensified not only over what Nick stood to receive, but over what the others were left with. According to the document, Rob Reiner allocated 20% of his estate to Tracy Reiner, his adopted daughter from his first marriage. That share, estimated at roughly $40 million, was intended to support her family and long-term stability. By contrast, the remaining 10% of the estate was split evenly between the two other biological children, Jake and Romy Reiner, leaving each with approximately $10 million, a fraction of what Nick was set to inherit. On paper, the numbers alone felt jarring, but the will also contained a brief, emotionally charged explanation. Rob wrote that each of his children had their own path, but that Nick would need the opportunities I am able to give him more than the others. It was, by his own words, an attempt to protect the child he feared might not survive without help. That explanation divided public opinion almost instantly. Some viewed the decision as an act of compassion, a father trying desperately to save a struggling son. Others saw it as a painful example of favoritism, arguing that Jake and Romy were effectively penalized for becoming independent, stable adults. The comparison only sharpened the backlash. Tracy, though legally equal as an adopted child, was seen by some as already established, with her own career and family. Jake and Romy, meanwhile, had built their lives without relying on parental wealth, yet were left with the smallest shares. Was this fairness based on need? Or was it a miscalculation that ignored emotional consequences? As the numbers spread across social media, critics began asking uncomfortable questions. Does unconditional love justify unequal treatment? Can generosity toward one child unintentionally harm the others? And when money becomes a substitute for guidance, does it help or does it quietly make things worse? What was once a private family decision had now become a public moral debate, with no clear answers and no side untouched by resentment. Long before the will was written, those close to the family say a troubling pattern had already taken shape, one that quietly shaped every decision that followed. Nick's life had long moved in cycles. When his struggles intensified, his parents stepped in. Financial support was restored, housing was provided, opportunities were created. Each intervention carried the same hope that stability would lead to recovery. And each time, the cycle repeated. There were moments when Rob Reiner and his wife attempted to draw firmer boundaries. Financial assistance was reduced. Expectations were set. At one point, Nick was reportedly asked to leave the Brentwood home in an effort to force independence, but the distance never lasted. When Nick faltered, his parents returned, driven by fear that without intervention, he might spiral beyond repair. This cycle did not exist without conflict. It created growing tension inside the household. Sources close to the family described repeated disagreements between Rob and Michelle over how far protection should go. Rob, deeply emotionally attached to Nick, believed that continued support, even at great cost, was an act of love. He believed that responsibility, stability, and long-term assets could still offer his son a chance to rebuild. Michelle, by contrast, increasingly favored stricter boundaries, mandatory rehabilitation, tighter financial controls, and clear consequences for repeated failures. These disagreements were not abstract. They shaped daily life inside the home and slowly transformed care into conflict. When the details of this family dynamic became public, outrage spread quickly beyond legal circles and into social media. Many began asking whether Rob's love and indulgence had unintentionally helped create the conditions for the tragedy itself. Online platforms filled with anger and disbelief. How, critics asked, could a father leave nearly everything to the child who struggled the most, while the others, who lived responsibly and independently, were given so little? Jake and Romy were frequently described as well-behaved, self-sufficient, and unfairly punished for standing on their own. Psychologists also weighed in, suggesting that extreme favoritism, combined with unchecked access to money and power, can create a dangerous psychological environment. In Nick's case, they argued, repeated rescue without firm boundaries may have reinforced a sense of immunity where consequences no longer felt real and limits gradually disappeared. This outrage reflected a deeper truth. Love, when paired with limitless indulgence, can harm not only the person being protected, but the entire family structure around them. Many expressed deep sympathy for Jake and Romy, who were pulled into a devastating tragedy they did nothing to cause. Yet, even amid the criticism, there was sorrow for Rob himself, a father who loved his children unconditionally, but whose devotion may have crossed into blindness. As one comment on X put it, this is proof that love without limits can sometimes be more dangerous than hatred. By the time the will was written, the family was no longer managing a crisis. They were living inside a pattern, one that had already shaped the outcome long before anyone realized how far it would go. For Jake and Romy, the shock did not end with grief. It deepened into something far more corrosive, a sense of betrayal. When the official notice of the will was released, Jake was not even in Los Angeles. He was traveling for work when the email from the estate management office arrived. He read it repeatedly, convinced there had been a mistake. 70% to Nick, 5% each to him and Romy. The numbers felt unreal. Jake later told friends that what hurt most was not the money itself, but the meaning behind it. For years, he and Romy had built independent lives, carefully avoiding reliance on their parents' wealth. They believed this was something their father respected. Now, the will seemed to suggest the opposite, that independence had been quietly punished. Romy reacted with disbelief and anger. The Brentwood house, the center of their family life, was now destined for the brother accused of destroying it. To her, the decision felt like a final erasure not only of fairness, but of shared memory. Within days, grief turned into resolve. Jake immediately returned to Los Angeles and requested an urgent meeting with the family's estate attorneys. He made one thing clear from the start: this was no longer about disappointment. It was about stopping Nick from inheriting anything at all. Together, Jake and Romy began assembling a legal team. Their strategy was direct and aggressive: to challenge the enforcement of the will, to push for immediate application of the Slayer Statute, and to freeze Nick's share of the estate while the criminal case unfolded. They were no longer willing to wait. To them, allowing Nick access to money, property, or power while facing murder charges felt not just unjust, but dangerous. In private meetings, they questioned how someone with no stable income could suddenly afford elite legal representation. The timing raised suspicions they could not ignore. What began as mourning had now hardened into confrontation. For the first time, Jake and Romy were no longer reacting to events. They were moving to take control of the narrative, and the fight was only beginning. Just as Jake and Romy prepared to escalate their legal challenge, the conflict took an even sharper turn. A new figure formally entered the battle: Tracy Reiner. Tracy occupied a unique position within the family. She was Michelle Singer Reiner's biological daughter from her first marriage, and later legally adopted by Rob Reiner, making her both emotionally and legally tied to the couple at the center of the tragedy. For years, Tracy had remained largely outside the conflicts surrounding Nick. But when it became clear that Jake and Romy were not only attempting to block Nick's inheritance, but were also questioning her share, Tracy moved quickly. She retained her own legal team and filed motions to protect the 20% of the estate explicitly allocated to her in Rob Reiner's will. Tracy's position was direct and uncompromising. She argued that she was not an outsider to the family, as some critics implied. She was Michelle's biological child, Rob's legally adopted daughter, and had been intentionally included in the will. In her view, the document reflected a deliberate and conscious decision by Rob, not an oversight or mistake. Her attorneys reinforced that argument with the law. Under California statute, an adopted child holds the same inheritance rights as a biological one. Tracy's claim, they stated, stood on firm legal ground. Any attempt to strip her of her share would be met with an aggressive countersuit to uphold the will, excluding only Nick's portion if the court applied the Slayer Statute. This development shattered any remaining illusion of unity. What had begun as a conflict centered on Nick now fractured into a three-way war. Jake and Romy viewed Tracy's move as a deep betrayal, arguing that while she was Michelle's daughter, she had not shared the same upbringing or sacrifices within the Reiner household. Tracy rejected that framing entirely. She maintained that her connection to both parents by blood and by law gave her every right to stand where she was. To challenge her inheritance now, she argued, was not about fairness, but about exclusion driven by resentment. At this point, reconciliation was no longer possible. The inheritance dispute had evolved beyond money. It had become a fight over identity, legitimacy, and who truly belonged at the core of the Reiner legacy. As the family conflict splintered into multiple fronts, the battle shifted from emotion to procedure. The question was no longer who deserved what, but who could legally stop the money from moving. Attorneys on all sides focused on one immediate objective: freezing Nick's access to the estate. Under California law, the Slayer Statute does not always require a criminal conviction to take effect. A civil court can intervene if it finds, by a preponderance of evidence, that the accused intentionally caused the deaths. If that threshold is met, the court can treat the accused as having legally predeceased the victims, triggering an automatic forfeiture of inheritance rights. Jake and Romy's legal team moved quickly to push this argument. They requested emergency measures to prevent any transfer of assets, including income generated from film royalties, licensing agreements, and real estate holdings. Their concern was not hypothetical. With ongoing revenue streams tied to intellectual property, delays could mean millions of dollars quietly flowing into the wrong hands. But the estate was not governed by a will alone. Much of the Reiner fortune was structured through trusts' legal entities designed to manage, distribute, and protect assets over time. Trusts operate under their own rules, often granting trustees discretion to delay distributions during legal disputes or criminal proceedings. This raised a critical issue: who controlled the trust, and how much authority did they have? If the trust contained clauses allowing distributions to be frozen during indictments, or if trustees deemed payment contrary to the interests of the estate, Nick's access could be blocked, regardless of the criminal timeline. But if the trust lacked such safeguards, the law offered fewer automatic protections. Timing became everything. Civil courts move faster than criminal trials, but they require evidence. Lawyers began racing to file motions, secure injunctions, and establish intent before any irreversible transfers occurred. Every day without a freeze order increased the risk that assets could be leveraged, pledged, or spent on legal defense. The inheritance dispute was now a strategic contest, one measured not in years, but in hours and filings. And while the family fought to lock the doors, one question lingered beneath every motion. Had Nick already found a way inside? As the civil court battle accelerated, attention shifted sharply to one man at the center of everything: Nick Reiner. From the beginning, Nick's legal posture appeared calculated. Rather than focusing solely on disputing the facts, his defense signaled a different objective: dismantling the element that mattered most for both the criminal case and the inheritance fight: intent. Under California law, the Slayer Statute hinges on whether the killing was intentional. If intent is proven, inheritance rights collapse. But if intent is legally negated, the statute may not apply at all. That distinction turned Nick's mental state into the most valuable asset in his defense. Nick's attorneys began emphasizing his long history of addiction, psychological instability, and prior treatment episodes. The implication was clear: if Nick could be found not guilty by reason of insanity, the court could conclude that he lacked the capacity to form criminal intent at the time of the killings. And if intent disappears, so does the automatic bar to inheritance. Legal analysts noted that this strategy was not only about avoiding prison, it was also about preserving access to the estate. A successful insanity defense could simultaneously reduce criminal liability and reopen the door to tens, possibly hundreds of millions of dollars. This dual-purpose approach unsettled observers. Mental health experts cautioned that addiction and mental illness can explain behavior, but they do not automatically erase intent. The key question would be whether Nick understood the nature and consequences of his actions, and whether he could distinguish right from wrong at the moment they occurred. Civil and criminal courts could reach different conclusions. Nick might fail in criminal court yet still prevail in civil proceedings, or vice versa. The outcome would depend on expert testimony, medical records, and how convincingly his defense could frame incapacity without appearing opportunistic. For the family, this strategy carried a disturbing implication. If successful, Nick would not only avoid full legal responsibility, he could legally inherit the very fortune at the center of the conflict. At this stage, the defense no longer looked reactive. It looked strategic, and behind every motion and psychiatric evaluation loomed an unspoken question. Was this a desperate attempt to survive or a carefully planned gamble from the start? As Nick's defense strategy became clearer, another question refused to stay buried. Not what his lawyers were arguing, but how he was paying for them. Nick's legal team was led by Alan Jackson, one of the most expensive and high-profile criminal defense attorneys in Los Angeles. His hourly rates were rumored to exceed $2,000 per hour, with total legal costs in a case of this magnitude easily reaching into the millions of dollars. For many observers, the math did not add up. Nick had no stable employment. His recent years were marked by addiction, instability, and repeated dependence on his parents for support. Yet within days of his arrest, he had secured elite representation usually reserved for Hollywood's wealthiest defendants. That discrepancy triggered immediate suspicion. Legal analysts began asking whether Nick had access to funds before the killings through trust distributions, advances, discretionary accounts, or assets that had not yet been frozen by the court. If such access existed, it could explain not only his legal firepower, but also raise serious questions about timing and intent. Family attorneys moved quickly to investigate. If Nick had drawn from trust-controlled funds prior to any freeze order, those transactions could become central evidence in civil court. Even if technically legal at the time, they could suggest foreknowledge or at least preparation for a prolonged legal battle. The issue went beyond money. It went to control. If Nick could fund an aggressive defense before the estate was locked down, he gained leverage time, resources, and strategic advantage. Every motion filed, every expert retained, every delay purchased with legal fees increased pressure on the other heirs. And the longer the case dragged on, the higher the cost for everyone. This is why the money trail mattered so much, not because of what it proved outright, but because of what it might reveal: access, awareness, and possibly intent. As civil filings multiplied and investigators followed the paper trail, the inheritance fight took on a new dimension. The question was no longer just whether Nick should inherit. It was whether he had already begun acting like someone who expected to. At the center of the inheritance war lies a figure that sounds simple but is anything but $200 million. The fortune left behind by Rob Reiner was not a single pile of cash. It was a layered empire built over decades, designed to generate money long after cameras stopped rolling. A significant portion came from intellectual property. Through his work as a director and producer and as a co-founder of Castle Rock Entertainment, Reiner retained back-end participation and royalty interests in some of Hollywood's most durable titles. Films like When Harry Met Sally, The Princess Bride, A Few Good Men, and Misery continue to earn through syndication, streaming licenses, international broadcasts, and anniversary re-releases. Then there was television. Residuals and profit participation connected to Seinfeld alone, one of the most lucrative television properties in history, have generated hundreds of millions over time for rights holders. Even a fractional share produces steady, predictable income year after year. This is why control matters more than headline numbers. Whoever controls the rights controls the cash flow. Royalties arrive quarterly. Licensing deals are renegotiated. Catalogs are packaged, sold, or leveraged. Ownership determines who decides and who gets paid. Real estate formed the second pillar of the empire. The Brentwood residence, purchased in the early 1992s, was more than a family home. With current valuations ranging from the low tens of millions upward depending on market conditions, it represented both emotional history and financial leverage. Additional properties, including a Malibu Colony beachfront home, functioned as both luxury retreats and investment vehicles. At peak times, the Malibu property reportedly commanded staggering monthly rental rates, turning location into liquidity. Together, these assets created a self-sustaining system. Money generated more money. Royalties funded maintenance. Properties appreciated. Trusts preserved structure. What Rob Reiner left behind was not just wealth, it was a machine. And machines raise one unavoidable question: who should be allowed to run them? Because in this case, inheritance is not only about distribution, it is about stewardship, about whether legacy is defined by blood, by law, or by the ability to protect and manage what was built. The fortune is vast, but the power it represents may be even greater. As the legal battle expanded, the dispute took on a deeper meaning, one that could not be resolved by statutes or court orders alone. At its core, the fight was no longer only about money. It was about identity. For Jake and Romy, the question felt painfully personal. They saw themselves as the children who built independent lives, honored their parents' values, and stayed clear of the chaos that had consumed Nick. To them, legacy meant responsibility, earning the right to carry the Reiner name through conduct, not entitlement. In their eyes, inheritance was not a rescue mission, it was a recognition. Tracy viewed legacy differently. She argued that family is not defined by convenience or narrative, but by commitment, by years of shared life, legal bonds, and mutual care. She had been Michelle's biological daughter and Rob's legally adopted child, intentionally included in the will. For Tracy, questioning her place felt like rewriting history. And then there was Nick. Nick's claim was the most troubling of all. If the court accepted that he lacked intent, he could legally remain an heir despite standing accused of destroying the very family whose name he bore. That possibility forced an uncomfortable question. Can legacy survive when blood and harm intersect? Those close to Rob Reiner say he believed legacy was built on love and protection, not punishment. He worried about the child who struggled most, and he tried, perhaps fatally, to solve that struggle with resources instead of boundaries. But critics argue that legacy also requires limits. Psychologists and ethicists note that when inheritance becomes unconditional, it can blur the line between compassion and enablement. In that sense, the Reiner conflict reflects a universal dilemma. When does helping cross into harm? As the siblings squared off, the Reiner name itself became the final prize not as a brand, but as a moral inheritance. Whoever emerged with control would not just manage assets, they would define how Rob Reiner's life, choices, and values would be remembered. And that is a verdict no court can truly deliver. As the legal battles continue and court dates loom ahead, one truth has already become impossible to ignore. No matter how the judges rule, this family has already lost something far greater than money. The inheritance dispute surrounding Rob Reiner's legacy exposes a painful reality that resonates far beyond Hollywood. Laws can decide ownership. Statutes can block or restore rights. But no legal system can repair the damage done when love, fear, favoritism, and silence collide inside a family. Rob Reiner spent his life creating stories about morality, justice, and human complexity. Yet the final chapter of his own story now unfolds not on a screen, but in courtrooms, legal filings, and public debate. Was his greatest mistake loving too much without limits? Or was it believing that money could save what boundaries could not? Perhaps Nick is a victim of illness. Perhaps he is a calculating opportunist. Perhaps the truth lies somewhere deeply uncomfortable in between. Jake and Romy fight not just for fairness, but for recognition. Tracy fights not just for money, but for legitimacy. And Nick fights for survival legally, financially, and psychologically. In the end, the courts may determine who gets the fortune, but they may never determine who deserved it. So we leave the final question to you. If you were in their place, who should inherit Rob Reiner's legacy? And where should love have ended before it became destructive? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Subscribe to follow the next developments in this unfolding family tragedy. Because some verdicts are handed down by judges, but the hardest ones are decided by conscience.